I invite you to go over to the Gospel of Matthew chapter 12 this morning as we continue in our series together for this Lent, Walking with Jesus, to walk like Jesus. And we've been following Jesus around the Gospel of Matthew so we can see how he operated in the world around him, and so we can learn how to operate in the world around us. And so far we have gone with Jesus into spiritual warfare, faced with three temptations of the devil, temptations around provision, protection, and power. And in that we learned the way he addressed those challenges is by remembering what God has said to and about us, and remembering who we are and who God is. Last week, we followed Jesus as he traveled from place to place, observing the crowds around him who were like sheep without a shepherd, failed by their leaders, and left helpless and harassed by the brokenness of our world. And we learned the way to address these issues with the crowds around us is to remember who they are and what God says about them. Well, today we move forward in Matthew's Gospel and we come to a passage with a new set of challenges, one that cuts it down into our ideas about religion, relationships, and how Jesus challenged the assumptions of those around him and showed what God values above all else. And so we start in verse 9 with number 1, the value of the Sabbath. And if you grab your Bible, we're going to look at this real quick. It says, moving on from there, he entered their synagogue. There he saw a man who had a shriveled hand, and in order to accuse them, they asked, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" Now, in a way of quick recap where we are, because you notice verse 9 starts with, it says, and he moved on from there. And so the question for us is, well, moved on from where? And, well, he had just had this encounter with the Pharisees. They had been passing through this grain field on the Sabbath, and they were hungry. So the disciples began to pick off some grain so they could eat. And now our first reaction may be, well, they probably shouldn't be doing that. But same reaction the Pharisees had, but for a different reason. But they are actually in perfect compliance with the law. Deuteronomy 23:25 allowed for those who were in need to take from a field as they needed instead of going hungry. This is the same provision and principle that Ruth had when she was gleaning the fields for a Boaz for her and her mother-in-law. So they were in compliance with the law. And this is what we talked about last week a little bit, is that God made special provisions through the law to care for those who are in need. There's civil structures to care for the needy that were put into place. And this is God's design for how humanity is supposed to work, that the needs that sin has created in our world would be filled by his people as they follow his way. And the design and purpose of it all is to point to the all-sufficient God who provides for all of our needs. Well, the Pharisees had no problem with them picking the grain. They just had a problem with what day they were doing it on. They had classified this as working on the Sabbath, which was the mandatory day of rest. And so Jesus countered them with an example from the Old Testament, leaving them dumbfounded, and so they kind of backed off. And then he moves on in verse 9 to the synagogue. But they had not forgotten the debate that they just had. They followed him there, and they were hoping to maybe catch him in another opportunity. And so a man with a shriveled hand was there. And we aren't really told much about what was going on in this circumstance, what led to this event, but we can imagine, based on what we're given, that it's likely this man knew who Jesus was. He knew his reputation. He probably saw him come into the synagogue, and he probably approached him to be healed. And I'd say it's likely that, given what we know in Matthew's Gospel, he probably followed Jesus down to the synagogue for that exact purpose. Something we'd seen several times so far. We saw, for instance, a Roman centurion who had come to Jesus on behalf of his servant, a man whose daughter had gone into this comatose state who chased him down, a woman with a hemorrhage who had come and found him. All these people had come to great lengths to find Jesus, believing that he could bring the healing that they were looking for. And this man was likely very much in the same vein. His hand had been twisted for most of his life, if not all of his life. And he approaches him and asks him to be healed. Well, the Pharisees had caught all of that. They didn't miss a detail. And so they asked the question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Well, they've been caught with the question of picking grain because there was a clear law and clear established precedent there that put them in their place. But this was another issue entirely. And again, we might think this is kind of a crazy question to ask. Why wouldn't it be lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Well, because what we don't know is what's behind this question. There's actually been a long-standing debate about this very thing in their day. There's two schools of rabbinic thought that were predominant in this day. You had Shammai and Hillel, and the Shammaites, who were the predominant view among the Pharisees, said it was not allowed to pray for healing on the Sabbath, which is kind of a weird position to take, but okay. And then you had the looser school, who were the minority group. They said that it was allowable in some cases to pray for healing on the Sabbath. Well, if you want to break it down a little further, is the Shammaites thought the Hillelites were too liberal, and even to the point that they believed they were breaking the holy days, defying the law, get this, for praying for healing on the Sabbath. Yeah. You want to talk about splitting frog hairs. And this is not because, and now the Pharisees didn't bring this question up because they're a bunch of sticklers. You know, that's the picture we have in our mind. It might be honestly because they genuinely cared about something. They had a genuine concern. They thought that Jesus was going to be leading people astray by doing this. That may sound counter to what we've heard over the years, the picture we painted of the Pharisees, but newer scholarship interacting with these ideas around the Pharisees and what they did give a bit of a different picture. You see, the Pharisees were not the heartless legalists that we paint them as. They're actually very zealous, pious, serious people. And it's not that they don't care about the hunger of the disciples. It's not that they don't care about the plight of the man with the shriveled hand. It's that they care above all about God's honor. Their concern is that by Jesus doing this, he is bringing dishonor on God by picking the grain on the Sabbath, by healing this man on the Sabbath. That Jesus is dishonoring God. And so they ask him these questions. They challenge him on these fronts. Remember, they thought everyone who thought this way was liberal and leading people astray. And the Sabbath in the Mosaic law was based on a divine pattern. They knew this. God creates in 6 days, rests on the seventh, making the Sabbath holy. Observing the Sabbath in the Torah is of the utmost importance. It often carries very severe penalties for defying it. And to reject the Sabbath for them and for every zealous Jewish person is to reject the law and in effect to reject God's order. Now, the Pharisees were sticklers for the rules maybe, but not just because they loved rules, because we all know those people who just love rules and just love pointing out that you're breaking the rules. We've all worked with one of those people. But that's not their point. That's not the way they're thinking. It's because they truly believed that God is honored by keeping the Sabbath. And so they did not want to see anyone brought into dishonor by breaking the Sabbath. They believed by keeping the letter of the law so closely, that was the best way to glorify God. Now, when we read the Gospels in the 21st century, we tend to paint the Pharisees with some caricatures. We tend to paint them as these enemies. And our way of looking at things is the heroes. But we need to remember one thing. Is in the story of the Bible, there's only one hero. We're not it. We are just as bad as the Pharisees oftentimes in our seriousness and our desire to honor God. Sometimes we miss God in our observance. Now, I come at this from my background. I grew up in fundamentalism, which I characterize as absolutely no fun and oftentimes very damn mental. But in fundamentalism, there is this great respect for the rules. There's a value placed on following the rules to the letter. And though I believe the fundamentalist system of belief is wrong and out of balance, over the years, as I've thought about it, the longer I've spent out of it, I've started to recognize the humanity behind it. And you all know somebody like this, so just put this in your mind. It's not just because they love the rules, it's because they want to honor God. But sometimes that zeal to honor God leaves God behind. And that's the problem here with the Pharisees. They were so consumed with trying to honor God by their obedience that they forgot God in the background. They started chasing the law of God so much they forgot about the person who wrote it and what he truly valued. And that can be our problem in our churches so often. We can be so consumed with the issues we deem important that we lose God along the way. Our belief in the important things must always be aligned with the entirety of God's heart and God's design. We believe, for instance, God's placed a value on all life. So that means, yes, we believe abortion is wrong 100%. But we must also believe that the life of a senior citizen who is abused and ignored is just as valuable. The life of a veteran on the street is just as valuable. The life of a prisoner is just as valuable. The life of a kid whose family was going hungry a few months ago that you guys stepped up and provided food for is just as valuable. We do believe that. We do believe that God has placed a value on it because He created mankind in His own image. He placed a value on it. That's why we stand up for justice. That's why we do things like run a food drive. That's why we support the missions that we do that support recovery, that support the persecuted church, that support those who are in need. Those are part of our values as a church, to see the entirety of God's design and God's value, not just the sole issue of it. And it's not so we can have a platform so that we can stand piously upon, but so that we can have a place to work from out into our world, that value of valuing life. We believe also that prayer and Bible reading are important. But, we have to note that if we spend 15 minutes in prayer and praising the Lord and then 30 minutes later we're berating those on social media, what good is it really doing us? We believe in loving our neighbor, but we grumble about the homeless guy in the corner of the street. We believe in loving our enemies, but we dehumanize, insult, and demean those who think differently from us. Are we so concerned, like the Pharisees, with being right that we forget to do right? Are we so consumed with the correct theology that we forget the correct application? That is the question here, because the Pharisees were so sincere in their theology, so sincere in their value of the Sabbath, but in valuing the Sabbath, they forgot what the Sabbath was all about. We can be so sincere in getting some things right, but if we don't remember the reason for it, then we miss the whole point. Where they valued the Sabbath, Jesus wants them to remember the value of those it was created for, which is number 2. We see verse 11. It says, He replied to them, Who among you, if he had a sheep that fell into a pit on the Sabbath, wouldn't take hold of it and lift it out? Jesus answers their question with a counter question. This is a classic rabbi debate technique. They do this all the time. So Jesus is answering in this fashion in which these discussions would happen this way. He's kind of doing this number on them. They decided, well, we're going to pull a rabbinic debate into it and see which side you fall on. He's like, okay, if that's how you want to play, we'll play. And so he asks the question back to them in the rabbinic fashion. And he asks it in this way, in a rhetorical counter. He's like, if you had a sheep that fell in a pit, aren't you going to take it out? Now, in this culture, here's a question. Okay, have you ever wondered why on earth is there a pit there? When you start reading the Bible closely, you suddenly see these kinds of phrases and you go, why on earth would they say that? So there's a reason for that. I looked it up. And in that culture, they would dig these pits as a way of deterring predators from the flock. Wolves and other predators would come sniffing for sheep, and they would wind up in the bottom of a pit. But sometimes, as would happen with sheep, they would be the ones who found themselves in the bottom of the pit instead. What was designed for their protection became an issue of harm. And so, as any of you who have animals have probably dealt with something similar to this. My dog, for instance, if she goes out in the front yard, I put her on a cord. Well, she seems to forget that she's on a cord and then winds herself all around things, and she gets herself stuck and starts whining and barking at me like it's my fault. And we've all had that experience with our animals. They get themselves in a predicament, and then they stare at you like, why did you do this to me? And so the picture that Jesus is painting is very much like that. It's this idea of this sheep that's down in this, this shepherd going out to check on his sheep on the Sabbath, and he looks down in this pit, and there's a sheep staring up at him like, why did you do this to me? This is an absurd, goofy, funny picture he's painting here to point out how ridiculous their argument is. The question then is this: is it work to get the sheep out of the pit on the Sabbath, or is it a necessary allowance for the life of the sheep? Odds are the sheep's not going to do well down there at the bottom of the pit. It would be hungry, cold, it might even get itself hurt trying to get out. So is it worth it for the man to get the sheep out? Well, they would answer, of course, because he would lose the sheep would die, and also he would lose all the value from that sheep. It was a harmful situation all the way around. Now, there was a school of thought from the Essenes who were kind of the extreme fundamentalists who would say, no, you got to leave the sheep there. But they were a very strange and strict school that were out there. But most schools, the Pharisees included on their very conservative side, would say, yes, you get the sheep out. Why? Because life is worth more than blind adherence. So Jesus finishes it here in verse 12. A person is worth far more than a sheep. So you tell me, he says, is it lawful to do what is good on the Sabbath? So in this picture that Jesus just painted for us of this sheep, there's also a bigger picture of what's going on. A bigger painting, a metaphor. See, the pit can maybe represent a little bit of what we saw last week, that systemic failure, where the shepherds failed to care for the sheep. They had left them alone and scattered them. And sure, they'd done the bare minimum. They'd done a little bit of what was necessary. They dug the pit to keep the predators away, after all. What more could you want? But at the bottom of the pit is the sheep and not the predator. The sheep had been left to fend for itself and had not gone so well for it. This pit, it can also be a picture of the pietistic observance of the law. One had been so concerned with keeping every letter, so worried about making sure that God was honored in their keeping of the law, that it forgets to see the person who's stuck at the bottom of these pits. There's this idea that I'm sure you've heard about before, this idea of cliffs versus fences. The cliff being defiance of God's law. We go over, when we leave God's way of doing things, when we defy God's order, we go over the cliff. So the idea was, well, what if we invented a couple extra rules and put a fence over here to keep people from ever even getting close to that pit, that cliff? Well, there's the same problem. Sometimes your fences end up just tangling up the sheep even worse, leaving them stuck, maybe not in a pit, but just as helpless and just as hurt. So it was lawful. Jesus was Jesus' answer, because he reached out and he pulled that sheep out of this pit. The man's hand was healed. And so our lesson here that we see, I wonder sometimes, and the Pharisees, of course, didn't like that. It says they went out and plotted how they might kill him. So that didn't go so well. But I wonder sometimes if we have a bit of the same problem in the way we practice our faith. Are we so consumed with making sure that we are right that we forget to do the right thing? Are we more concerned with being good than doing good? It's an easy pit to fall into. We're Western thinkers, after all. We like order. We are the only kind of society that ever would have dreamed up an Excel spreadsheet. Because that's the way we are. We love things neat, tidy, listed out, and orderly. In fact, some of us need to have everything listed out for us. In our marriage, I'm the spreadsheet guy. Hillary's the make it work person. And a lot of you, if your marriages, there's a spreadsheet person and then there's the other person who comes up with the ideas, the other one who's designated to organize that other person. Lee and Amy are opposites. Anyway, there's nothing at all wrong with that. That's the way we think. But you don't miss what I'm saying. Sometimes we're so focused on the steps in our way of thinking that we miss the whole reason those steps are there. Man was not made for the Sabbath, Jesus said, but the Sabbath was made for man. The purpose of the particulars of our faith is not to follow rigidly so we're good, so we don't get God mad at us. It is so that it's meant as a guide. It's a template to help us shape us into a way not to earn God's favor, but it's a way for us to make systems that bring us into God's way, that usher us into God's order. These systems are not there for us to serve, but to serve us. Well, how do we boil this down? How do we boil all this down into a bite-sized thing? Well, this shows us that what God values in our obedience is not necessarily our conformity, but it's in our reaching what He had designed it for. Our obedience to God is holistic. It's not checking off a list. It's bringing us more in line to bringing His order to the world. An order that creates Sabbath for man, not man for the Sabbath. An order that creates value for life, not just for one, but for all. An order that teaches us to love our enemies, not just on Sundays, but Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday too. It is not the matter of making our conformity the centerpiece of our faith relationship, because in that we lose the main point, we lose the big picture. But it's the idea of keeping in focus what is truly valued in God up to God's eyes. And if you keep your sights set on the main goal, you're not going to deviate into sin. You will be obedient. You know, navigation. Mark Foley always uses this as an illustration. He talks about airplanes. They have to stick to the path. Keep their eye on the goal. Stick to the path. Keep going forward. Because if you deviate just a slight degree, this way or that way, you'll be here at one point, and you'll be over here before you know it. Got to keep your eye on your destination. Keep your eye on where you're going. The idea here is Jesus like, if you keep your eye not on the details down here, but on the guide right here, all this is going to fall itself into place. And you'll see what God really values. You'll honor God by following Him. This may mean we need to take some time to reflect, to consider ways in which we might have put the cart before the horse, the way we've dug our own pits and then fallen into it. It means we may have to lose some of our religion and find our faith again. Because in losing some of the focus on our conformity, we'll gain a perspective on what God truly values. The Sabbath was not made for man. Your obedience, God's law, God's order, God's rules, whatever you want to call it, was not made, man was not made for that. It was made for man, us, as a guide to bring us closer to God's heart. Amen? Amen. Please stand. We're going to pray. Lord,